Welcome to this video that I call the Dilemma of Incomplete Information. For the record, I'm filming this on January 28th of 2021. I am going to admit up front, this one's going to be a little dry and boring. It is necessary. Also, this is not per se an aeronautical topic, and this topic needs some more work, so let me make this as bearable as possible. Let me jump right into it. Okay, so the Dilemma of Incomplete Information. So first of all, who holds the information that we're trying to share with one another? So the pilot, and it can be the flight crew, but the pilot is going to be the one who is in the best position to understand the status of the airplane, assuming that this is some kind of mechanical difficulty or whatever. Okay, they're also going to have what I'm loosely calling the windshield view, so they can actually see what the weather is like outside. In some situations, they might be in and out of IMC, and that might be particularly relevant, and we just don't have access to that information. Also, they might be able to look outside and see what the local terrain is just outside the windshield, whether it's an off-airport landing or whether they're setting up for landing on a runway or something like that. So they're going to have information that will itself be incomplete, but then there's also going to be this question of how are they going to transfer the relevant information to us controllers about the kind of stuff that the pilot has access to. Same kind of thing happens with the controller and what I'm loosely calling the air traffic control team, those who are helping the controller talking to the pilot. In effect, we're the ones who are going to have information about the NAS. So we're going to have information about not just the permanent status of things like runway lengths and alignments and things like that the pilot might be able to access on his or her own, but they're so busy they don't have time to go into their avionics or whatever and fish that information out, so they're asking us for that information. It can also be more temporary information like NOTAMs or what the exact current METARs are. Stuff like that. So first of all, there's a question about who holds the information, and then there's going to be this dilemma because so many of these emergencies, there are significant time constraints. How are we going to share these with one another? And I think in terms of like two sets of information flow. The first set is between the pilot and the controller. So the pilot is going to be relaying information to the controller and vice versa. The controller is going to be relaying information to the pilot. Both of us can be busy. So the pilot's going to be busy flying the airplane, dealing with the emergency, stuff like that. And the controller, obviously, we have all of our regular traffic, even if we're trying to shift some of that away from us right there. But there are some interesting things about understanding that information flow from the pilot to the controller and from the controller to the pilot. And then I'm going to do one slide on each of those, and then I'm going to do a separate slide on the last two in a combined thing. And one, that's just the interaction between the controller and the ATC team that is assembled to help the controller who's actually talking to the pilot. And this one, I think sometimes we almost have a deluge of information, and we get stuff that gets lost and so on, and it can make things muddled. So I do want to give some thought to that. So let's get started. So as far as the pilot to the controller, in effect, if you look at all the videos that I'm building on the website, and granted they're version 1.0 and they can be improved over time, but in effect, a big chunk of what I'm doing and why I'm not maybe as apologetic about the length of the videos as perhaps I should be is because really what I'm trying to do in a lot of ways is try to explain the way that pilots speak and the way that pilots think and the way that pilots perceive things so that controllers can understand it, because the pilot, we don't want them to be having to telling us repeatedly. We don't want there to be misunderstandings. So in effect, a big part of this course is about explaining things in a variety of ways to controllers so that when a real emergency presents and somebody says, for example, I've had a vacuum pump failure, or I have a suction problem, or I'm partial panel, or I've lost my gyros, okay? Those are all essentially different ways of describing the same kind of thing, and I can't tell you in advance. I can't dictate what pilots are going to say, how they're going to describe that kind of thing. And so all of those, in effect, need to be introduced to controllers so that when a pilot says that, we can understand that kind of stuff as accurately as possible, as quickly as possible without having to turn and kind of ask somebody else in the air, hey, what does it mean if the pilot says that, she's partial panel, okay? And without having to ask the pilot repeatedly. And there are frankly so many things that a big part of this course is about covering all of that stuff. Okay, as far as the controller to the pilot, the way I'm going to put it on the slide is this. So first of all, efficiency. The pilot's time is precious. The pilot or flight crew, they're up to their eyeballs, maybe running checklists, flying the airplane, dealing with all kinds of stuff. They can certainly have the stress of the emergency, and that affects the way they process things. Okay, and they can't spend all of their time talking to us. So when it becomes necessary for us to pass whatever kind of information along to them, we just have to be mindful of that. And related to that, we need to make sure that we're not trying to give them so much information that they can't process it all at one time. So we have to chunk our information. Another thing about being efficient is actually you got to slow down to go fast. And some controllers are trying to pack as much information as they can into as little time as possible, and they speak so fast that the pilot doesn't get it. You know, when I first started working towards getting my flight instructor rating, one of the absolute best pieces of advice I got was to not confuse the idea that an instructor has said something with the idea that the student has necessarily understood it in such a way that they might retain it. You know, because otherwise you might just, as an instructor, drop a syllabus of things to talk about. You check the box that you've talked about all of them, and then later you get mad at the student, let's say, because they haven't learned, you know, whatever, you know, situation. And that's not really true. As a good instructor, what you want to do is try to pass information on to the student in such a way that they can actually use it, okay? And there's a responsiveness there to see how the student is learning it and so on. By analog, when the controller is talking to the pilot, and this is not a flight instructor to student type relationship from controller to pilot. I don't mean a hierarchy in that sense, but I do mean it in the sense that we want to make sure that they're actually getting the information, okay, rather than us just spitting it out, because that way in some lawsuit, if somebody ever says, hey, did you give them information about X? We go, oh yeah, look at the transcript right here, line 36. We told them about whatever. Now, we need to not think about that. We need to think about getting the pilot information in a very usable format. So that's what I mean by efficiency, and the pilot's time is precious. As far as filtering, this is something that I think can be done better. Not always, but I think there are absolutely emergencies I've looked at, and I'll be coy about identifying any specific examples here, where controllers need to be a little more comfortable in certain cases about filtering information, you know, from the wall of information, that huge pool of information that's available, and just filtering it down so that we're only giving the pilot a limited amount. Now that might scare some of you because you think, uh-oh, you know, for liability reasons, we got to feed them shovelfuls of information. But related to the efficiency, one of the ways to be efficient is to filter information for pilots. And so in many cases, give 2 or at most 3 options to a pilot when you're looking at options. For example, just a quick example, let's say you have a rough running engine situation. Okay. Pilot says, you know, what do I have for nearby airports? In effect, and I would also want to simplify this, but it might be something like, okay, we've got 2 airports. We've got one that's real close. It's kind of short, or we've got a longer runway farther away. Which one would you like? And I would even describe it more or less about that simply to the pilot without giving them reams of information about the details and so on. And so in that example, okay, they might come back and say, okay, well, how short? And you say, 3,000 foot runway. And they go, I'll take that one. But so don't be afraid of them maybe asking for a little bit of clarification, but don't try to give 46 different options. Okay, I've got this airport over here. Here's all the details. I've got this one. I've got this one. I've got this one. Here's all the details on the runway alignments, on the lengths, and what the wind is at each one, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And next thing you know, the pilot's like, okay, you lost me on the second or third airport choice. Just pick one for me. That's not a good way to approach things. So we want to filter. And so I specifically suggest giving 2 or at most 3 options to a pilot in most cases. And sometimes we're actually going to make the decision for them. We can do that when it's really obvious. We can do that if the pilot delegates that authority to us. So again, I'm not trying to hold pilots to a standard where we're going to come back at them in court or something, but essentially if the pilot says something like, vector me to the nearest airport, they don't want options. They're putting a lot of trust in us to pick something for them, and we are going to resolve this time constraint by just going ahead and initiating a vector to the one that we think that they will want. And again, that's easier said than done sometimes. Again, just in the rough running engine example, let's suppose for the sake of discussion that the close airport that's got a shorter runway is maybe on the left, and the farther airport with the longer runway is over to the right, just for the sake of discussion, okay? And somebody says, I got this, rough running engine, I need a vector to the nearest airport. Well, do you turn them left towards the short, close one, or to the right with the long runway that's farther? Now, some controllers might think, okay, well, I better punt on that, and I better give the pilot these options and so on. But again, there's always going to be a judgment call here. But if the pilot says, give me that vector, that's really up to the controller to do, because if you're saying, well, option 1 is over to the left, and it's et cetera, the one to the right is here's what that one is, and so on. Now, they're not heading for either one, and that can be creating a bad situation. So it's going to be a judgment call in some cases. In other cases, the pilot, and I've heard this expressly, says something like, I'm too busy, you pick for me, and that one's pretty obvious. Others are a bit more subtle. But there's times when we are going to make the decision for them. If it's obvious, I want you to have the confidence to do that. If the pilot delegates that authority to us, I also want you to have the confidence through the materials I'm building up in this course to pick something that's at least reasonable, and so on. Okay. And then the last slide, and then we can get away from this rather dry topic, is the interaction between what I'm loosely calling the controller and the controlling team, okay? And just a couple of quick thoughts on that. One thing, and I should have done this here, let me just go back to this slide real quick. Notice for the two sets of these interactions, what's common to all of them? The controller. And again, the pilot's the one that we're trying to save, along with anybody on board, his or her aircraft and so on. But in some sense, this all comes to a head with the controller who's talking to the pilot and so on. And so with that in mind, once you very quickly get something like a team or a small team assembled to help the controller that's talking to the pilot, it's always going to be a bit of an ad hoc situation, a bit of a mess, but to the extent we can, and this could certainly use some more work, I'd actually like to think in terms of designating, in effect, two formal or semi-formal roles within the team. One of them is I'd like somebody to be the scribe. Now, I'm going to describe this as if it's a center environment. I'm a dumb center person, so that's what I know. I'm not a smart tower approach person, right? But speaking from a center's perspective, it might be a D side, okay, who is going to volunteer and expressly say, the way I'm kind of looking at this, I will be the scribe, okay? And that scribe's basic sole job is just to listen to the frequency and to write it down. And they're doing that in part to make sure that nothing from the pilot gets missed, and so that we don't have to ask the pilot repeatedly, but also as that team maybe starts to grow, and it's not going to grow huge maybe, but as that team starts to grow over the next minute or two and other people are coming on board, instead of having to add workload to the controller talking to the pilot, trying to figure out, okay, so what's going on, how can I help, what do you want me to do, that kind of interaction sort of goes through the scribe, okay, and that way I think maybe we're improving to make sure that we're not missing things from the pilot. It can be a travesty in some cases if the pilot says something and we're so busy turned around telling the controlling team what's going on that we miss some vital piece of information. Okay, so that's loosely what I have in mind with the scribe. There might be other cases where somebody like an FLM or CIC designates somebody as a scribe. I actually have in mind this might be something of somebody who volunteers, who just steps up early on and says, I will be the scribe. I also think it's good, and again, this could use some more work, and this is not meant to be too formal, but it's good to have somebody, and it can be more than one person, who is in effect the strategist, okay? Now, when an emergency first presents, we might naturally assume this is just going to be a frontline manager or a CIC and so on, but if for whatever reason we do have a quote-unquote advanced pilot-rated controller who's going to come in, and, so they might be there in just, 30 seconds because they were at a nearby sector, or it might be somebody that we paged back from break, when we paged for all pilot-rated controllers to the east area or whatever, okay, that whoever's coming in, we have one or more strategists, okay, and the strategist's job is really to try to not get too involved in the exact second-to-second details in some way, but to try to kind of calm it down, slow it down, and try to get ahead of the situation in two particular ways. So, first of all, what is the pilot going to need next? And so this person, again, can be FLM-CIC, can be an advanced pilot-rated controller, might be thinking, okay, this pilot is going to want to know, the localizer frequency and the MDA altitude for some, whatever instrument approach, okay? And so we get ahead on researching that, and that way, in some hypothetical situation, pilot says, hey, I need the localizer frequency and how low can I descend on the approach? Instead of saying, stand by, we're going to look it up, and then we're having to scramble and do that, we've already got that ready to go. So try to get ahead of the situation. The other way that the strategist might try to get ahead of the situation is to figure out, okay, how is this going to cascade? So again, let's assume you've got somebody with the rough running engine, and just for the sake of discussion, they've got a rough running engine, they picked up a big vibration, they say, what do I got for nearby airports? And the controller initially says, well, you got a short runway off to the left, it's nearby, or an airport that's farther away, longer runway off to the right. And the pilot, for the sake of discussion here, says, okay, I'm going to go off to the right. Okay, so they start heading off towards that farther airport, longer runway, okay, but maybe a strategist is coming in and is saying, okay, how is this going to cascade? Rough running engine, this can cascade to total engine failure, and if so, do we think they're going to make that airport? And if not, get started on looking at what kinds of off-airport options might be available in that area. Make sure we've got the surface wind ready to go, okay? And so, again, in this hypothetical situation, somebody turns to the right, they're heading for this airport that's a little bit farther away. It might be, okay, that to the north of this new route of flight over towards this airport that they're diverting to that's 20 miles away, it might be, for the sake of discussion, that to the north of that is really just kind of rough terrain, and to the south there are definitely some farm fields. Get it ready to go, so as they're diverting to that airport, if they come back and they say, no, my engine just failed totally, we've already got it ready to go, okay? Turn 40 degrees right, and that should give you a good choice of farm fields out in front of you, or whatever, every situation is going to be different. But the idea is this could use a lot of work. But instead of having just a team kind of get together and everybody's scrambling and there's no coordination and so on, I think some formality can be brought to this. So this could use some more work, but I'd like to see somebody volunteer early on to be a scribe, and I'd like to see one or perhaps more than one person as it progresses become officially, as it were, the strategist. So this needs more work. Sorry, it's dry. No fancy graphics, no flight sim stuff, no YouTube videos, and it's not even an aeronautical topic, but it's something we have to think about. Thank you.